Lee woke up to the taste of bitterness on his tongue. It wasn't the kind of bitter that makes you spit. It was the kind that tells your body, quietly, that someone is trying to keep you alive. His eyelids felt heavy like stones. His head throbbed. The air around him was warm. He tried to move, but his muscles felt weak, as if the fever had drained every part of him. He turned his head slightly. Lee was there, not asleep, not distracted, sitting close, calm as a mountain, watching Lee's breathing like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. A small lamp burned nearby. Shadows trembled on the wall, where bundles of dried herbs hung in neat lines. Lee tried to speak. Only a dry sound came out. Lee leaned forward and placed cool cloth on Lee's forehead. Then, he lifted a small bowl and held it close to Lee's lips. Lee drank slowly. Warm, bitter, earthy. The warmth spread through him like a slow fire. Not painful, but steady, as if it was pushing the sickness back step by step. Lee spoke softly in Chinese. Lee didn't understand the words, but the tone felt like a promise. You are not alone. Days passed in a blur. Sometimes Lee drifted into dreams that felt like Nigeria, dusty air, loud streets, hunger in his belly. Sometimes he dreamed of the boat, the darkness, the moving floor. He would wake suddenly, his heart racing. Each time, Lee was there. Each time, Lee brought him back with simple actions. Water, herbs, silence, steady breathing. Slowly, the fever broke. Lee's sweating stopped. The pounding in his head softened. His eyes became clearer. But when Lee finally sat up, he realized something frightening. His body had changed. His arms looked thinner. His legs trembled when he tried to stand. The weakness was deeper than tiredness, like the fever had stolen a piece of him. Lee hated feeling weak. On the streets, weakness was an invitation. In this house, weakness was something Lee treated like a lesson. Not shameful, but important. He placed a hand under Lee's elbow and guided him step by step, letting Lee feel the floor, the air, the weight of his own body returning. That night, Lee gave Lee a small bundle of herbs to smell. Lee pointed to it, then to Lee's chest. Lee inhaled slowly. The scent was sharp, clean, and strong. It opened Lee's breathing like fresh wind. Lee nodded. Then, Lee handed Lee a second herb. This one smelled sweeter, softer. Lee pointed to Lee's stomach. Lee understood without words. These plants were a language, and Lee was teaching him how to read it. The next morning, Lee woke Lee before sunrise. The sky was pale, and mist floated over the fields like a thin blanket. The village was quiet, but not asleep. Somewhere far away, an animal called out. A rooster answered. Lee walked outside and stopped on a patch of flat ground behind the house. He faced Lee, then he bowed slightly. Lee froze. He didn't know what the bow meant, but he felt the seriousness in it. Lee moved his hands slowly, showing Lee a stance. Feet apart, knees soft, back straight, eyes forward. Lee copied him. Lee circled him like a teacher, inspecting a student, adjusting Lee's shoulders and hips with gentle taps. Then Lee stepped back and demonstrated a sequence of movements, slow, controlled, precise. It wasn't a dance. It was discipline. Lee's hands moved like blades through air. His feet barely made sound. His breathing stayed steady. Even when he struck, he did not look angry. He looked focused. Lee tried to copy. He failed immediately. His arms moved too wide. His balance slipped. His breathing became fast. Lee stopped him with one raised finger. Then Lee repeated the movement again, slower. Lee watched carefully. He tried again. Still wrong. Lee didn't scold. He didn't laugh. He only corrected. Every morning became the same. The sun rose, and Lee trained Lee. The training was simple, but not easy. Lee learned to stand still without shaking. He learned to breathe through discomfort. He learned to keep his eyes calm even when his body wanted to panic. Sometimes, Lee would suddenly clap his hands or strike the air near Lee's face, not to hurt him, but to test him. Lee flinched at first, every time. Then, slowly, the flinch became smaller. One day, Lee clapped loudly right beside Lee's ear. Lee did not flinch. Lee paused, then nodded once. Lee didn't smile, but something inside him lifted. It felt like power, not power over others, power over fear. After training, Lee took Lee into the fields. Lee showed him plants, not with long explanations, but with careful gestures. He pointed to a leaf and crushed it in his fingers, letting Lee smell it. He pointed to a root and snapped a tiny piece, showing Lee the inside. Lee looked at Lee's face while Lee smelled, watching his reaction, teaching him to notice this leaf for swelling, this root for fever, this bark for pain. Lee never said the words, but Lee began to connect the meanings to the smells, the colors, the textures. Lee showed Lee how to dry herbs properly, out of direct sunlight, away from moisture. He showed him how to store roots so they wouldn't rot. He taught Lee that medicine was not magic. It was patience and accuracy. Lee began to help. At first, he only carried bundles and clean tools. Later, Lee let him measure water, grind leaves, and stir mixtures over fire. Lee corrected him when he moved too fast. Lee corrected him when he guessed instead of observing. And Lee learned the hardest lesson. You do not heal people with confidence. You heal people with truth. Months became years. Lee grew. His shoulders broadened. His legs became stronger from morning stances. His hands became steady from grinding herbs. His eyes became quiet, not empty quiet like a person who watches before he speaks. He still spoke little. Language was still a wall. But inside the wall, Lee was building something powerful. He was becoming someone new. In the village, people began to stop looking away when Lee passed. Some nodded politely. Some watched him with curiosity. Some still avoided him, but the fear in their eyes was changing. Not fear of a stranger, fear of what they didn't understand. One afternoon, Lee heard shouting outside. A boy had fallen while running near the fields. His knee was swollen and bleeding. The boy's mother screamed, panicking, pulling him toward Lee's house. Lee came out calmly. He examined the injury quickly. Then he looked at Lee. Lee's stomach tightened. Lee gestured toward the herbs inside. Lee moved without thinking. He brought leaves Lee had shown him before. Lee crushed them and applied them carefully, wrapping the boy's knee with clean cloth. The bleeding slowed. The swelling began to calm. The mother stared at Lee and Lee like they were not normal men, like they were something else. That was the day Lee understood something new, not fame. Healing changes how people look at you. Sometimes it brings respect. Sometimes it brings jealousy. And sometimes it brings danger. More people came after that. Not crowds yet, but a quiet stream. A farmer with joint pain from long work. A woman with itching eyes from allergies. A child with stomach cramps. A man with a swollen insect bite. Lee handled each case with calm precision. But he began to involve Lee more. Lee would point, and Lee would bring the correct herb. Lee would pause, and Lee would prepare the water. Lee would watch Lee's hands carefully, correcting small mistakes with tiny gestures. Lee began to recognize patterns. When a person spoke too fast, it was fear. When their skin looked pale, it was weakness. When they touched one spot repeatedly, it was pain. Lee learned to observe before acting. He learned that people often lied about their pain because they were ashamed. He learned that real healing required trust, and trust required calm. One evening, Lee brought out an old wooden box. He opened it slowly. Inside were objects Lee had never seen. Up close, small tools, thin needles, dried roots wrapped in cloth, and a faded notebook filled with Chinese writing. Lee pointed to the notebook, then to Lee, then to his own chest. Lee didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "This is my knowledge. I am giving it to you." Lee's throat tightened. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he bowed, copying what Lee had done years ago. Lee nodded. Years passed again. Lee became a teenager. Then, older. His body looked strong now. Not bulky, but trained. His movements were quiet and controlled. He could stand still for long periods without shifting. He could hear footsteps from far away. He could sense tension in a room before voices rose. He could also heal, not fully alone yet, but with guidance. Lee allowed Lee to treat small cases under supervision. Lee's hands, once trembling, were steady now. He could grind herbs without spilling. He could boil mixtures with correct timing. He could wrap a sprain tightly without cutting circulation. And Lee learned one more lesson. Healing is not about being admired. Healing is about responsibility. One cold morning, a stranger arrived at the village. The man looked exhausted, his clothes dusty, his eyes frantic. He spoke rapidly to villagers, pointing toward the road behind him. People gathered. Their faces changed. Fear spread like smoke. Lee listened calmly, then looked at Lee. Lee's stomach tightened again, because he had seen fear before. Fear meant something urgent was coming. Lee walked toward the crowd with steady steps. Lee followed. Villagers spoke over each other, their voices rising. Someone pointed toward the fields. Another pointed toward the river path. The stranger kept repeating the same words, faster now, as if time was running out. Lee pushed through gently and asked short questions. Then Lee's eyes narrowed. He turned his head slightly, listening, like he could hear danger from beyond the village. Lee's breath caught, because even without language, Lee felt it. Something had happened. Something bad. Lee started walking quickly, faster than Lee had ever seen him move outside training. Lee followed, his heart pounding. They reached a small group of villagers, gathered in a tight circle near the road. A man lay on the ground, shaking, his face pale, his breathing rough. People stepped back as Lee approached. Lee knelt. He examined the man's leg. Then he froze for a split second. Lee saw it. A small puncture wound. 2 marks. Blood darkening the skin. Lee looked up at the villagers. Their eyes were wide with panic. Then Lee looked at Lee. The look was not just a request, it was a test. A final test. The villagers noticed Lee looking at Lee. Their attention shifted. Their fear moved. And suddenly, every eye turned toward the foreign boy who had been learning in silence.